welcome. I want to thank everyone for being here. My name is Enrique Desmond-Arias. I am the director of the Bildner Center for Western Hemisphere Studies. We are privileged to have with us here today Jamie Lee Andreson, who received her PhD from the University of Michigan. She is a postdoctoral fellow with the Institute for the Research on the African Diaspora in the Americas and the Caribbean at the CUNY Graduate Center. Dr. Andreson is also an assistant teaching professor of history of women's gender and sexuality studies at the Pennsylvania State University. Her research focuses on the politics of race and gender in the Candomblé religion of Brazil through ethnographic and historic methods. She is currently finishing her book manuscript, Divine Femininities, Matriarchy, and African Heritage in Brazil, which centers on Black priestesses as major architects of the Brazilian multiracial democracy. Her previous publications include a Portuguese language book published with the Editora UFBA in 2019 and an article in the Journal of Africana Religions, which this talk is based on. Welcome, Dr. Anderson. And after Dr. Anderson finishes talking, we will have some discussion from Professor John Collins of Queens College and the Graduate Center. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Desmond.
You're welcome.
It sounds loud. Hey, we can be loud. Well, thank you so much, Desmond Arias, for that introduction, and the Bildner Center for inviting me to give this talk. Thank you to you all for being here. Rosalina Lopez as well for organizing. Iradoc, where I'm a fellow now in the CUNY Graduate Center, which I'm getting to know currently, as well as John Collins for his remarks and participation. So I'm going to be sharing my research today based in Bahia, Brazil. It's ethnographic and historical research on the politics of cultural heritage among Candomblé terreiros, which I translate as temples, and their negotiations with the state in democratic Brazil. So that's a recent history in Brazil, right? Post 1985 to the present, the most recent democratic moment. And throughout this talk, I'll go over the interdisciplinary methods that I employ and the long-term engagement I've developed with Afro-Brazilian religious communities throughout the last 12 years as a publicly engaged scholar. So I'm going to present research that demonstrates how the adaptation of cultural heritage status to historic temples protected sacred land for religious communities led predominantly by Black women. I will also discuss the shortcomings of cultural heritage in the case of Candomblé, as these policies do not address widespread issues of land insecurity and ongoing religious and environmental racism that most practitioners continue to face. So to start, I'd like to analyze this opening picture. It's taken from the vantage point of a historic temple in Salvador, Ilea Sheapoa Fonja, established in 1910 by the priestess Mai Anina, who was a first-generation woman born in Brazil to African parents. And so this is from the vantage point of the terreiro, and I'd like to ask you all to start. What do you observe about this photo and what it might suggest about terreiro territoriality? Pretend you're undergrad students.
It's an island of green in an area where most green has been extirpated.
But it's remote. It's remote, far from the city.
Yeah, it's like inside the city, but this sort of green preservation, very clearly contrasting with the urban environment, but within it, what else?
Except from the upwards vantage point, you're looking down from the dome. Reminds me of like how this Catholic church in Montreal has this really high point.
And you may know if you visited Brazil, like a lot of the favelas are on hills as well, sort of in the peripheral regions of the city.
Doesn't appear to be located in the most affluent part of the city.
Right, you can see the difference between the buildings on the coast, right? The high rises, the sort of middle class bourgeois, living versus the housing developments, sort of more informal housing, construction. Anything else?
It also seems to include a great diversity of plant species. including some useful ones.
Right, right, so biodiversity, yeah, being preserved within these religious territories, so that's why, I wanna think about like environmental effects of this cultural heritage as well. And really just conceptualize what territoriality means in the Candomblé context, which, is urban, but really depends on access to natural resources and preservation of those as representative of the deities themselves. So I'm going to situate the Candomblé religion in contemporary Brazilian society. I'm also a historian. I'm not going to give you the historical version of how Candomblé, developed in Brazil, but hopefully you'll get a sense of that. I'm also not providing a theological, example or explanation of Candomblé, but I can do my best to answer any questions. I myself am not an initiate, so I'm very engaged in these public negotiations. And I'm really interested in this question of monumentation of African heritage in the Americas, using Brazil as a key site, but thinking more broadly about Black reparations in multiracial democracies. So Candomblé is one of the longest lasting cultural legacies from African peoples in Brazil, and the terreiro served as a rare and essential convening space for Africans and their descendants throughout Brazilian history to share common cultural frameworks, aggregate religious practices, evoke African languages, music, dance, and reconstruct kinship networks despite violent conditions of persecution and discrimination. So Candomblé is a religion that originated from rituals in West Africa, but it was uniquely constructed among Africans of diverse ethnicities and their descendants in Brazil. Importantly, it wasn't institutionalized, as a religion in fixed houses of worship until the 1830s, which is quite late, in the development of Brazil as not even a nation at that time, right? Still an empire. So Brazil has the longest history of slavery in the Americas, abolished only in 1888. But the oldest temples that are continuous to today were founded in the mid-19th century or the early 20th century. But despite this kind of what may seem like a recent history, much of the work of exchanging and developing African ritual frameworks occurred throughout the preceding centuries of Africans, including from Congo-Angola region, which was really predominant in the slave trade in the earlier centuries. And today, the various ethno-linguistic groups from the African continent are memorialized through different nations or nações of Candomblé. And these are really religious identities that refer to ancestral knowledge from African peoples. And so some examples of those would be Ketu, Nago, Congo, Angola, and JJ. Once again, I can answer questions about that if you're interested. So Afro-Brazilian religious practices, they were widespread throughout Brazil in the colonial period and really concentrated in coastal cities where most African and European populations lived. And so the city of Salvador, being a major site for the development of Afro-Brazilian religions and the particular version called Candomblé, right? Salvador in Bahia. Salvador was the first colonial capital of Brazil and a major site for the importation of African captives in the slave trade until its abolition in 1850. And today, the state of Bahia, where most of my research took place, is popularly understood as the African cultural epicenter of Brazil. And to take it even further, a priestess, Maya Nina, from Salvador in the 1930s, coined it to be the Black Rome, so really emphasizing its centrality in African diaspora religions of the Americas. And in the 21st century, the Candomblé religion is ubiquitous throughout the city of Salvador. So we'll focus on this map here, which is just this tiny peninsula of Salvador, right? And you can't even see all the dots because of the colors, but these are sites of terreiros of different nations throughout just the metropolitan region of Salvador. And so this was from 2008, and the temples that they were able to map, which is probably not even all of them, right, was 1,408 temples in just one city. So just to be really clear, this isn't like a fringe religion, particularly in Salvador, in Bahia, but it's also become a national religion, particularly throughout the 20th century, when Candomblé could be more public. I'll talk a little bit more about how it reached kind of the end of persecution, but it was persecuted by the state up until the 1970s. And so after that, there's a proliferation of Candomblé throughout Brazil, and even globally throughout Latin America, and North America and Europe. I'm hearing like in Portugal, there are a lot of Candomblé practitioners now, and in Europe too. In California, the Bay Area, here in New York City. And then we also want to connect Candomblé, to African diaspora religions like Orisha worship, so practice in the Caribbean, particularly even West Africa and the United States. So it is a global religion, and connected to other religious practices from West Africa, particularly. And my broader book project looks to the head priestesses, which are self-proclaimed matriarchs, so the Candomblé matriarchs, as the privileged keepers and transmitters of intergenerational African histories. So they act as the head mothers of their religious families. Here is an example of my Lucia of the Terreiro São Jorge Filhos da Goumeia. And I was just like presenting this photo because I think it visually represents like the concept of matriarchy in Candomblé. And so throughout my research, I spoke with several Candomblé mothers. We did oral histories. I also did archival histories. I'll talk more about methods in a second. And through that, I learned about many more influential Candomblé matriarchs in Brazil's history. Yet popular and scholarly narratives in Latin American history often overlook the contributions of Candomblé priestesses as central to the development of the Brazilian nation. When they appear in historical narratives, they're often referenced as auxiliaries or cultural symbols, rather than strategic political actors and fierce community leaders. So my current book project, Divine Femininities, argues that throughout the 20th century, the Candomblé matriarchs were key protagonists in the construction of Brazil's multiracial democracy, and that their public efforts shaped popular understandings of Black women's leadership as a key feature of African heritage in Brazil. This isn't a book talk, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the broader project. So I'm going to focus more, on the questions regarding cultural heritage. So what brought me to this research, and why does it matter in Brazilian politics today? Or to think more broadly, how does this research inform our understanding of monumentality and recognition of African heritage in multiracial American democracies? So framing the question this way allows me to consider the implications of Candomblé heritage struggles together with campaigns to destroy and replace Confederate monuments in the United States, for example. These popular social movements are informed by an impetus to recognize, remember, and memorialize the ongoing effects of racialized slavery in the construction of democratic American societies. In many ways, these struggles are about how the story is told and who are the primary narrators. So the Candomblé temple's fight for recognition as Black monuments aligns with strategies throughout Latin America to use political openings in the sphere of cultural politics to redirect resources, of which land is central, particularly to Black populations. And the application of cultural heritage status to Candomblé temples symbolically represented the importance of Africa and Black Brazilians in the construction of the nation. So in the 1980s, that's kind of what the conversation is about. But the most tangible effect of this policy is that it redistributes land as a resource from colonial legacies of land ownership to select Afro-Brazilian religious communities. So in this way, I think it's one of the few policies of reparation that actually is in effect. It's very limited, though, which I will talk about. And then, as I mentioned the last slide, I'm drawn to this research and the religion as an important site for understanding the hierarchies of race and gender in American societies. There are a few examples of communities where elderly Black women are at the top of a very strict social hierarchy, as in Candomblé. So I'm interested in the potential of these alternative arrangements of race, gender, and power as a counterforce to normalized white supremacist heterosexist patriarchy, to quote bell hooks. So this research, I really focus on analyzing petitions and campaigns in which Candomblé temples appealed to government cultural agencies from the 1980s to today, really. And this research examines how these shifts in the politics of cultural heritage during this process of democratization consecrated into law protections for a very limited number of temples, defined by a particular African territoriality as constructed in Brazil. And I'll just say the spoiler that there are only 12 temples today that are federal heritage sites. And in Salvador alone, there are 1,500, so this is a select case. A major source for this research were the processos de tombamento, which I translate as heritage cases. John knows a lot about these processes. So these case files, it sounds kind of mundane, but we really need to understand what's in them because they're so rich. They're compilations of sources about the history and structure of a Candomblé temple when they appeal, so that it's their petition to say this is why we deserve recognition. And importantly, a lot of that is created by the temple leadership themselves. So that's why I see it as like a public presentation, of their history from their perspective. But together with that, the agencies contract anthropologists and architects and these state bureaucrats to actually map out the physical infrastructure. Because once again, this is about materiality, this is about land, right? This is about resources. So they're just very multimodal sources with maps, photographs, newspaper clippings. And you'll hear about the two acronyms EFUN and EPAC, because that's the Federal Institute for Historic and Artistic Patrimony, and then this Bahamian state one is EPAC. Also gives a mention of like public scholarship projects and just my kind of ethnographic engagement throughout the course. So this project is informed by a much larger engagement that I have with Candomblé communities that started around 2013 when I did my master's program at the Ethnic and African Studies at the Federal University of Bahia. And most of the ethnographic research I did from 2016 to 2018 during my doctoral program at the University of Michigan. And during that ethnographic experience, these are two examples of like public seminars that I attended, and I'll narrate a little bit more about them later. I accompanied several public campaigns for historical and cultural recognition that were organized by Candomblé leaders and practitioners. Among the most impactful was the centennial celebration of the Bachipoya Temple in 2016, over there. When I collaborated with a team at the university to record the oral histories of the ritual family in a documentary project. And then additionally, over the course of 2 years, I followed the campaign from another temple I'll talk about, Tumba Junsada, in seeking federal heritage status from IFUN, approaching their centennial celebrations in 2019. So now I'm going to shift, to the territoriality and kind of understanding the world of the temple. So it's an African territory uniquely constructed in Brazil, which includes, like we already discussed, these natural open areas that surround multiple physical structures that are connected to elements of nature because the deities are those forces of nature. And so the offerings happen, at the river, at the base of a tree, with herbs that need to be collected, right? So it's a whole ecosystem, and it's very community oriented. So that's another interesting question about, land ownership isn't really the right way to think about it because it's not about individual, ownership of land. If anything, the deities own the land and no people could possibly own the land, right? So just kind of questioning what like land occupation means, particularly in this religious community. And then, to highlight once again, these are spaces that really differ from the dominant Brazilian culture, machismo, of white supremacy. And so it inverts traditional hierarchical structures of Brazilian society in terms of race and gender. And there I'm quoting like Cheryl Sterling, Rita Segato, among others. So this is one of my favorite parts of the research actually, was that I was able to do archival research into this question of African land ownership or cultivation or stewardship, to understand, before 1916, because that's the official date that the Bachifoya Temple was founded, based on the land title that the founder bought himself, right, to have that legitimacy. But in the oral histories, there's a lot of mention, a much deeper history of African land use and occupation. So the prevalence of African-born leaders and their descendants and the establishment and cultivation of the temples emphasizes the materiality of African religious practice and encourages a discussion of African in Brazil beyond just sort of an ideological reconstruction, like there's material continuity here. And although these sites were very diverse and widespread throughout Brazil, right, in the early 16th century up into the 19th century, it's only kind of up till the early 20th century that they're like institutionalized and fixed on these plots of land. And many of these temples in that period are founded on small plots located within larger properties that were owned by wealthy plantation owners, right? And so these large landowners, very obviously beneficiaries of these colonial policies, exploitative economic hierarchies, slavery, they own more land than they could monitor, than they could cultivate. And so this is sort of similar to a history of Maroon communities of quilombos as well. And so African-born and Black residents were living on these properties, before they had the sort of legal land ownership. And I was able to trace that, particularly through this map and like the land titles from the founder of Bachifoya, who's memorialized here at the temple. He's referred to as Bernardino, Manuel Bernardino da Paixão. And so this map from 1893 outlines the use of the former Bachifoya plantation by various Africans and their descendants prior to when Bernardino purchased the land. And in the reflections of elderly Bachifoya initiates, the historicity of the very land is recognized and respected. They identify themselves as inheritors of the land, passed down through generations of African and indigenous residents that used the space and depended on it for their survival. So continuing that legacy is the central mission of the Bachifoya Temple. And I'll just quote a few excerpts from these interviews. They highlight the spiritual connection with the land and communication through the deities. So Dona Heda said, she was an elderly initiate of the temple. She expressed, quote, "The temple is a sanctuary. These trees here all have life. And what we are doing here is being witnessed, not by matter, but by them. They exist. They are forces." So them being the deities, end quote. And because of this very profound connection to the land, the late Makota Katia Alexandria also affirmed, quote, "This house is, as I always say, a place where nobody should enter with shoes on. This here is a sacred space. This was already a Candomblé temple before Bernardino was able to get these lands for him," end quote. So Bernardino is like the official beginning, right? But they're connecting to much deeper histories of the land. So the priority of the temple today, is to uphold the legacy of these historical actors as upheld by the ritual families. And that's the primary concern, right? So pretty much all the negotiation, all the dialogue with the public and with these state bureaucrats is to maintain, their continuity of land ownership, which is constantly under threat because of urbanization, because of gentrification, displacement, pollution, deforestation. Like there's so many forces that they're constantly, having to protect their land, their autonomy, their right to worship, right? It's an ongoing battle. So rather than seeking individual ownership, the Candomblé communities consider themselves stewards of the land. They demand legal rights to use the territories and exercise religious freedom. So this is really like a religious freedom issue, which is protected by the Constitution. And understanding the cultivation of land by Africans and their descendants, as I mentioned, encourages a more material approach to African land cultivation in Brazil. And the future of the religion does depend on access to material resources, including fresh water, forests, and secure lands that are required to maintain communication with deities and initiate future generations. So I'm going to turn back to a sort of longer history of Candomblé priestesses, just to give a sense of how they have always been in the public sphere and engaging with politics. Together with academics, informing popular culture, like this is Jorge Amado, together with my senora, Simone Beauvoir was there, Jean Sartre too, and these are like the cultural dignitaries of Brazil, not always framed that way. And so we have two, really powerful examples here. I've mentioned Mother Aninha, who was the founder of the Leache Afonja. She played a huge part in the 1939 federal law that guaranteed religious freedom under a dictator at the time, Getúlio Vargas. Aninha also participated in the Second Afro-Brazilian Congress of 1937 with international scholars like Melville Herkovitz, Donald Pearson, Edison Carneiro, Jorge Amado. And then her successor, I already mentioned Mother Senora, forging alliances with prominent anthropologists and artists, including Pierre Berger, Caribe, and Jorge Amado, to foster the religion's legitimacy with favorable representations in art and culture. So they've been really influencing, the narrative through, in the early 20th century, a lot of white male mediators. I would say I have a whole chapter about kind of the changes more recently where priestesses are writing their own histories and authors themselves and don't need that kind of mediation, as was very common earlier in the 20th century. And then here we have Mother Menininha, who led the historic Gantua temple. She became a larger-than-life cultural icon. She's featured in the biggest samba music of the 1970s, Tropicalia movement. She hosted politicians and national celebrities in her personal living quarters. And I just love this photo because she's hosting the Bahian governor, the state governor, ACM, in her private temple bedroom. She says, you come to me, I'm not going to your office. And she's so influential that yes, it's an important alliance. And actually, this alliance is what helped influence the passing of the Bahian state law in 1976, which for the first time in history outlawed state control of Candomblé ceremonies. So there are real effects, to this leadership and the very strategic alliances. And shifting to 1985, that's the end of a 20-year military dictatorship that had censored political dissent and education in Brazil. And the Brazilian Black movement, in conversation with Candomblé leaders, were central to crafting the democratic federal constitution that was implemented in 1988. And as part of the political reopening, federal and state initiatives established projects to map cultural monuments, recover historical memory, and protect Afro-Brazilian and indigenous sites through institutional measures. So that's where this application of cultural heritage starts to apply to Candomblé. And in this democratic making process, dialogue between the religious communities, Black activists, anthropologists, and politicians helped to define Candomblé temples discursively as African territories, paralleling similar claims to land made by Quilombos or Maroon communities, and similar to indigenous reservations in terms of redistributing rights and land in a multicultural democracy. And as recognized Black leaders in Brazil, the head priestesses of Candomblé figured prominently in this fight to gain collective land rights for their temples. They framed their struggle through multiculturalist discourse as an innovation of the democratic moment throughout Latin America to emphasize the religious nations of Candomblé, and to quote Tiana Pachel, to advocate for their claims to difference, this being a strategy for redistribution. So I'm going to shift to two ethnographic examples, the first one being from Tumba Junsara. So on August 3rd, 2018, the historic Angolan temple, Tumba Junsara, hosted their seminar, Rediscovering Our History, which was organized annually since 2012, under the leadership of the head priestess, Mother Irayilgis. She's featured right here. The event brought together the local neighborhood, Candomblé leaders, representatives from the lineage throughout Brazil, as well as professors and students from the Federal University of Bahia, and representatives from the local, state, and federal governments. And a prominent male initiate emceed the event in front of a long table, decorated with the Brazilian and the Angolan flag next to each other. And this MC really presented hostility towards the historic relationship between the temple and academia. He made it clear that academics cannot just come to Tumba Junsara any which way, that one has to step in here slowly, because the head priestess, Mother Irayilgis, has her own council. He exclaimed that the temple does not need intermediaries for other people to interpret their own history. They can do it themselves. The temple's message rang clear that day. We know our own history, we will register it ourselves and share it with whom we wish, when we wish, how we wish. We control our own representation, and we need to occupy public positions of power to construct policies that truly serve us. So that's me sort of paraphrasing that MC. Tumba Junsara offered an intentionally confrontational tone as an escalation of their long negotiation with the Federal Institute IFAN for pending approval as a Brazilian cultural heritage site. The urgency for this approval stemmed from land insecurities and encroachments onto their temple in the neighborhood, as well as the upcoming commemoration of their centennial in 2019. And so to not be swiftly approved at that particular moment would reflect negligence on the part of the cultural agencies, which had approved other centennial temples facing similar issues. A panel of three women, this is 1, 2, 3, I believe. A panel of three women represented the cultural agencies at the municipal, state, and federal levels, and they were up for scrutiny that day. The MC stepped back, like he wasn't even going to take that on, and he passed the mic to a doctoral student who was a former IFAN employee who was working with the temple in this process. And before the three government representatives had a chance to talk, the eldest male representative, Tata Emeterio Shushuka, held up a large bounded printed inventory. You can't really see it, but like, do see how thick this is scale, just to get the sensory moment here. He waved it around emphatically. He slammed it down on the table in front of the government authorities. He explained that inside of this document contained all the historical materials, all the artifacts, all the stories from Tumba Junsara, as well as their oral histories passed down from generations, written down, photographed, and organized by members of the temple. The IFAN technician responsible for this case looked at the thick booklet that had made a resounding thud with hesitant eyes and exclaimed, "I only have a week to write my report." Tata Emeterio reinforced that all the documentation had been previously turned in and that the symbolic act was to make sure that IFAN had no excuses, that it had gotten lost, for example, confronting them face to face to respond. And all that material and historical proof of their cultural value was now quite literally in IFAN's hands. So this was a successful act. The following month, Junsada did receive the official notice of tombamento. So this was like the last straw, I think. I mean, clearly they had done all the work, right? And so they did reach that status of federal cultural heritage site just in time for their centennial celebration. And they became the 11th Candomblé temple to achieve that in the entire Brazilian nation. So the second example I want to share comes from the centennial celebrations of the Territoriality in 2016. I had the pleasure of participating. It was months of activities. It was amazing organization. And all by the family themselves. So they organized the celebrations in 3 strategic sites that represent their historical engagement with public institutions. One was the Bahian State Assembly, or like the Congress. The other was the Catholic Church, where they still go to mass. And then the third was the temple itself, Terreiro Bachipoia. And then the documentary project was part of this. It was initiated by graduate students at the Federal University who are also affiliated with the temple to record the centennial moment. On December 2nd and 3rd, the temple hosted the seminar 100 Years of Bachipoia, including a full program of presentations and participations from political representatives, other religious leaders and academics, as well as local cultural activities. As a key moment in this seminar, the Center of Memory, funded by the Bahian state government, publicly signed a pact with the temple to create an official memorial to preserve and display the historical materials present in the temple. And I should say that the temples have their own internal memorials, but they usually don't have resources to actually, invest in it. And so this was a moment where it seemed like the state was gonna do that. So it was a very celebratory moment, and one of the leaders, was like, declared that the founder's dreams had finally come true. It was very celebratory. But so here is the eldest leader of the temple who actually passed away last year. At the time, she was 93 years of age. Her name is Dona Olga Conceição Cruz, goes by Mãe Guaguacense. She was the symbolic signature for this pact. Yet despite this grandiose performance where she shook, the hands of the state bureaucrats very publicly, following the centennial, no other initiatives were taken to develop this project that was so convincingly promised on that day. So to my knowledge, I visited last year and there was no change to the internal memorial. And I even followed up with one of the representatives from the Center of Memory. I had a meeting with him, trying to show how important this was, but it's one of those false promises. So this example reflects the centennial moment as one of great visibility for the Bachipoia temple and the Candomblé community in Salvador. But those public moments of celebration are seldom translated into durable material resources and sustained political engagement on behalf of the Candomblé communities. So with that, I'm going to end with the shortcomings of cultural heritage. So I mentioned that today, only 12, just recently last month, another Candomblé temple was approved by IFAN. So that was the 12th since 1986, which was the first one, Casa Branca, the oldest temple in Salvador. Now at the state level, IPAC, they have less power and resources than the federal, but they have registered over 20 temples, and they use both material and immaterial heritage. So it's kind of a wider net that they cast. And yeah, they have maybe less promises, but the main message is that the vast majority of temples petitioning for protection, they may never receive a response. I mean, I think Tumba Junsada waited 12 years to get their approval. So they petitioned way early, right when it was possible, when people were like, okay, it's possible, to get this. There are a lot of petitions, and Most of them are never even responded to, or it takes this public pressure, right, and this mobilization and like celebrities speaking out or academics, getting involved, like it's a very broad sort of movement to put pressure. And then, of course, thinking about who's in power in the federal government and what party is running, these institutions and what their priorities are, that also makes a difference. So the majority of these temples were approved like during the first Lula administration in the early 2000s. And so recently, perhaps that's changing too. But I think it's interesting that these movements to seek rights through cultural heritage have exposed the widespread structural issues faced by the vast majority of Candomblé temples, which cannot be addressed through heritage status alone. And importantly, not all temples are interested in seeking dialogue with the state for very good reasons. So in an informal interview, one priest said that the anthropologist responsible for his case never even stepped foot in his temple, but he achieved approval by the Bahian state in 2006. So it's like, how is it, it's like who you know or who you are, this kind of political capital will get you the status too. And I have a whole interesting part of the dissertation in the book where, white Candomblé leaders are getting this status more than Black women who are the original leaders of the religion. So there's a lot of interesting implications for race and rights and redistribution. And then other Candomblé leaders I spoke with just said they have no interest in engaging with the state. They prefer autonomy. They know that like Black communities supporting each other are the only way to survival. So several examples from my field research confirmed how Candomblé families guarantee the continuation of their own ritual practice and fight for their land regardless of state policy. So one initiate, Abachi Foya, illustrated how their land has divine protection. When land invaders tried to burn down the Abachi Foya forest, she said the land was protected by the winds of Iyamsa, the goddess of storms, which blew the fire away from the temple's property and eventually put it out. Her story showed the great force protecting the temple and that the Bachifoya family has always depended on their own forces more than any federal or state government bureaucracy, even after being nominated a federal heritage site. And these institutes were not originally intended to protect Tejeros, right? They're ill-equipped to do so. They don't have the cultural lexicon either, in many cases. And sometimes they just outright resist the demands of religious communities who often complain of the Institute's negligence and the false promises, even following their registration. So the more pressing underlying concerns remain practical access to land and resources to guarantee the future of religious practice, as well as racial and gender justice for Candomblé practitioners who face hate crimes, attacks, and systemic marginalization. And these broader structural issues are unaddressed by the limited gains of cultural heritage status offered by the state. So in the absence of sustained, meaningful redistributive policies, protections, and reparations, Black women remain the leaders of their territories and maintain generational ancestral knowledge, even in the face of systemic marginalization and discrimination. The forces of religious racism, hate crimes, economic vulnerability, land insecurity, deforestation, and pollution continually threaten religious practice and put immense strain on religious leaders and their initiates. When facing these constant challenges, networks among the initiatory family, among Black communities, and not any state policy have been the surest sources of support for Candomblé temples. Thank you. Yeah, many thank yous, many references. If you want any more, I'm happy to talk as well.
Can you say what the 12 temples were?
All of them.
I don't know, maybe not.
Most of them are in Bahia. I know most of the ones in Bahia. There's a few, like, do you know the region, like the Recôncavo?
She does.
There are a couple as well. There's some like Casa de Minas in, I think Maranhão, a couple. So the ones in Salvador, Ileaxé, Poranja, Casa Branca, Terreiro Gantua, Oxumaré, Terreiro Batifolha, Tumba Junçada. Those are the federal ones, that I know off the top of my head. But I did just go over, Ifan has it on their website. I just went over it to make sure I had the number right.
Oh, great.
And you can just search like Tejero and then it all pops up. And even the ones that petitioned, which I thought was really interesting that didn't get it. So yeah, I should do another Levantamento.
To piggyback on that question, do they give, is there any explanation of why certain ones are not given to, heritage status?
Yeah. So the main concern is continuous occupation of the land. And so that's why like these centennial temples are kind of the exceptional ones that have been able to continue on that land. But there are a lot of temples that have had to move for all the reasons that I mentioned, you know, displacement, right? And so if they can, it's all about how they convincingly can kind of pitch their history or their story of continuity, and particularly to the African continent, which is another, you know, it's like very difficult to do, right, through family relationships, but these old temples can do that. The ones established in the 19th century, you know, can say like, we come from an authentic African woman that's like dated and established. Yeah, so having like official proof, but like, we know where.
We had to move because of all these issues, and that's why we are essentially not.
Yeah, that's why
It's so funny.
it's such a troubled, instrument to actually address the problems that they're facing. But I also think it's a brilliant strategic adaptation of a policy, you know, in the cases that it did work, to say, hey, this is what we're working with,
Yeah.
like, this is all that we have. You know, how can we apply in our favor in a few cases? And I should say too, that these historic temples are like, they're the mother houses. And so they have sister houses, you know, all throughout. And so they're important for the nation in that way too. So just, you know, to say just 12, but they're the 12 that are originators of the nation or of a lineage that have followers throughout the country. So that's partially why they get that status. And that's why Bahia has been the main place where the temples get that status.
And what was the last thing? You said there was one that got one last month.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to look up the name, which I have. I just am not familiar with it. It's in Cachoeira in the Hequancohu region. So I can look that up. I think our moderator, do you wanna say the word?
I do want to say things, but I actually rather say things as part of the dialogue, because I
Okay.
actually think that you have a lot to say here, and people are joining in. But maybe I'll just sort of ask questions and.
Well, let me
step in.
answer, because I have this.
Please
So
answer.
it's Ile Ashe Isinimo Agonju Didewe in Cachoeira. That was just.
So the 12 mother temples are in the state of Bahia?
Not all of them.
Oh,
I think
well,
there are
yeah.
like 9 from Bahia.
And once they get that heritage status, then what? I guess that's.
Well, they can't be kicked off their land. That's what I'm saying. That's the biggest.
Well, I know that part, but I'm just wondering, is that the only reason?
There's cultural capital.
Status, I've heard people talk about it, and I'm like, well, what happened afterwards?
Yeah, well, in theory, the government like pays to reform or like do restore the physical infrastructure like they do for Catholic churches, right? That's like the actual policy, is to maintain the physical infrastructure. That doesn't always happen, and it takes a long time, but that is their job, you know, whether or not they're doing their job is like an ethnographic question.
Is there any link to IFAN, to the UNESCO heritage sites, or any money or any overlap or any kind of,
Not
I
sure.
don't know, inclusion?
I've never heard of that in the conversation. Have you?
a link to Avifan to UNESCO?
No, the particular tejeros, in other words, are any of the tejeros now UNESCO heritage sites?
No.
No. But I know what you mean, to kind of supersede the Brazilian state, yeah. Sure, one, two.
So I was interested, so maybe I'm coming at this from my own disciplinary perspective, but when I think about territoriality, I'm thinking about how people are thinking about space, right? Or how they're approaching space, right?
Mhm.
And we're hearing kind of about one type of territoriality, which is like this official territoriality, right? There's
Mhm.
spaces where people apparently bought the land, they're obtaining recognition. And, they're being defined in like kind of very discrete ways, right? But you also allude to in your talk, leaders of Tejedos who are kind of resisting this type of territoriality, right? You don't explore it, right? But there are people who are like saying, who tell you, well, I'm not interested in that. We don't need the state to recognize this. We're not interested in doing this. And I was kind of interested in like how they're thinking about land or how their lands themselves might be different, right?
Yeah.
Are these like these nice kind of groves that are separated from the city that are visible? Or are they different, right? Are they Tejedos that are maybe more embedded in the neighborhood? Are these people thinking about how they approach land or engage with property somewhat differently?
Yeah.
Ultimately, you kind of point to a third mode of territoriality, or at least of relationships between Tejedos, of kind of like the sister Tejedos, right? So the mother Tejedos are like these ones that get this recognition that are more prominent, right? But they have kind of like, outlying relationships, right, with other Tejedos. And I'm wondering if there's a territoriality to that, how those networks are built, and then a different type of thinking about land, both within those networks, about territory within those networks, but also in the differences in terms of how space is thought about at the mother temple as opposed to the sister temples.
Yeah, that's really great, helpful. So I think that there's a certain adaptability that is necessary, practicing living in these circumstances, and that it's precisely that adaptability that makes the historical record hard to trace, right? Because it's like the jogo, go where you can, go where there's space. And so I think there's a recognition of that it doesn't, it doesn't mean that the practice is any less valid if they're mobile, right? But there is a really clear hierarchy of prestige between the mother temples and the daughter temples or the sister temples. And I think that has to do a lot with the urban environment of Salvador and like post-abolition Africans establishing residence within the city. And so it's like a sort of urban quilombo, we could say, where it's also the land is so encroached upon. That was the first case of a temple that got the status as the most historic one. Casa Branca, founded in 1830s, a gas station was going to be built on their sacred land. So it was just like a really clear, appeal in this democratic moment. And so I think these mother temples are defending a lot more than land, right? They're defending like place, being, identity, contribution to the city, to Brazil, like importance, not just in the historic narrative, but in the fabric of the city. But Candomblé as a religion is like always been very adaptable, fluid, had to be. And I don't know if anyone's familiar with like Belizo de Jesus, her work, Electric Santeria, just talking about these diasporic networks and how, African diaspora religions are going to be practiced in an apartment in New York City too, right? And so you don't need the land, but that's why it's part of like this bigger struggle, right? In which I'm framing it in terms of reparations. And that was important in the democratic moment too, of like redistributing rights. So the Quilombo communities got the constitutional right to land in 1988. The temples didn't. And so they used like cultural heritage to kind of get that. But there was a precedence for it with the Quilombos. So I think that they were dialoguing with that policy. But I'm gonna think more about that and like how to frame it. That was really helpful.
I just add something to that. I had a similar impulse as Desmond, but it went a little bit differently. Desmond's asking about the relationships between sort of property regimes and the different types of tejero. But one of the things that I would recommend, and I come at this from a very particular perspective. I was actually just WhatsApping with a woman who was talking about, as a young girl, getting yelled at by people from Bachifolia for using the fountain to wash clothes. And she's from a family that her father was one of the leaders of people from, not from the Heconcobo, but from the Sertão, who invaded the other side of the valley from them in the Aja of the Hichiro. And so I guess it would be worthwhile to think this through in relation to overall approaches to property, broader approaches to property and documents in Bahia. I guess, and I want to jump from that to what you're just talking about in terms of territoriality and the diaspora. It's interesting, like you sort of left, you said they claim they don't need intermediaries. And that's an interesting claim in itself, right? What does it mean to negate intermediaries? Does that in fact emphasize intermediaries, right? Or suggest that you need to be very careful with intermediaries and choose them in different ways? And maybe they're different intermediaries. Maybe they're intermediaries across the diaspora who look like the participants, as opposed to, you know, the dean of social sciences of UFBA, right? Because in your historical pictures, Sartre in crowd was taken there by Vivaldo da Costa Lima. He took the picture. This is a famous Bahian anthropologist. So he is in fact a type of intermediary that was there, and very influential one, who's absent from the archive as you see it. And so I'm thinking about these absences and what does it mean? I mean, it's different to be absent from the archive because you're an incredibly wealthy, powerful social scientist who takes a picture of Sartre with my Menini, and you claim that you showing Sartre the sort of authentic side of your homeland. And you're using Black people to do that, right? That's very different from what we see going on right now.
Oh, wait a minute, that's not, the question is, what role did the intermediaries play
Well, that's what I said.
in their history, not now, in their history?
Well, what I'm saying is that you need to sort of think about the role of intermediaries in the history and the role of intermediaries today, and how those roles can be different. And they can be different intermediaries. And hence the Mais de Santo can also have different strategies towards approaching this. Who are they going to enlist? Right? Like Jamie, I think rightly points out that the dominant historical literature says, sort of forgets the agency of these women in reaching out. But that's the most interesting thing, right? Is like, in spite of everything, how do I make a claim to land? By grabbing allies, right? That doesn't take away from anybody's agency, but the nature of the ally and what you use, right? And so, if I could say a last thing, one of the things that was, you talk about symbols of ownerships, and so going back to land documentation in the area around Opofunja or Bachifolia is incredibly fraught. Right? And you actually become owner of a land by occupying it. That's how you become owner. And what you do is you thump a big file when somebody, or you pull out your gun, or you pull out your children, or you pull out your file when you're coming to be dispossessed. And what we've seen here is, like, I'm just wondering how you approach that file in your paper today. The throwing, I mean, I'm thinking back at there's really interesting historical literature on the relationship between Portuguese and Anglophone titles and claims to colonial territory, and this sort of symbolic nature of the the Portuguese versus the sort of Lockean mixing labor with the land nature of rights to land by the English.
Yeah.
And so the symbol is, so like if you say like my Meninia is just a symbol, well, like, symbols aren't just symbols, right? Symbols do stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess I'm sort of saying, let's think about the materials that are trundled out. Start there ethnographically, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's think about land ownership claims and how they're made. And then how it is that these women have insinuated themselves and demanded recognition by the state for material benefits, and what sort of material benefits come for quite some time, right? From that moment of ASEMES sitting down with my Meninia,
Mm-hmm.
but also today when, diasporic travelers go to Ile Haché,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it's still a form of engagement. Now, I'm saying multiple things, I think, but they're related, and they begin with these piles of documents, which are a sign of how one thinks about territory and property,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Sure. Go ahead.
I have a totally different question and thought process going on.
That's
And I
probably,
think it's only recently
I have to
that
marinate on all of that.
this has changed in Africa.
Hmm.
But if I'm not mistaken, in Africa, women did not own land unless they inherited it from their fathers.
Mm.
Now, if we could go back to the history of all of this, and I'm talking about when they first came, these women knew that they inherited the land from their parents, from their father. So why is that not brought up in this concept of who owns the land? Because I think now it's true in Africa, they've changed the rules that, this is established the way people get land.
Mm.
I understand what you're saying, that squatters, or whatever you want to call them, can determine that they own the land. But it's even more important to say, I inherited the land from my father. And where is the role of their children, if there are Black sons? Would the sons inherit this land? So
Yeah.
this is not at all addressed in your.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the case of the African women who founded the Tejeros in the 19th century, they wouldn't have it from their fathers because they were enslaved and taken away from.
But the mentality is there.
But what I see from oral histories, yeah, I'm not sure, and I know there's a lot of variety in the African continent as well in terms of like matrilineal and patrilineal societies, and then just placing us in time, right, when this was actually happening. So I can't say that I know all the property regimes of West Africa. But okay, so I'm approaching this ethnographically through oral histories as well. And what I hear and what I mention is that, yeah, they're inheriting the land from deities or previous cultivators of the land, and that they're meant to be on this piece of land, for divine purpose, basically. So that's how that's the information that I have. In terms of the very messy property regimes of Bahia, you're correct that I haven't studied property law very much at all. Maybe I should to situate
not
this
law,
better.
practice. Law doesn't matter.
Yeah, and I haven't, I've never done like an ethnography of favelas, for example, like the Tejeros are specific spaces, so it's true that I'm less familiar, with how like these claims to land, and I think I was trying to situate it within the ritual context because that's how it was presented to me, and justified.
What does that mean, the ritual content?
Well, as I was saying, that the land doesn't belong to anybody, like to humans. That the land has its own autonomy and agency. And so they are stewards of the land. And so it's not about ownership, it's about use rights. It's collective use rights.
Which actually works incredibly well with squatters' rights,
Yeah.
right? there's a correspondence there.
Yeah.
Whether like it's recognized or not,
Mhm.
admitted to.
Are you suggesting they should go link arms with the Saint Terra? I mean, that's an interesting
Well, actually,
idea.
what I'm actually thinking about the relationship between the Tejeros and the Meiji Center and then the communities that surround them.
Yeah.
Because they're not sort of transparent spokespeople for whether it's evangelicals, right?
Yeah.
Or somebody who wants their land, the
Yeah.
gas station owner. right?
Yeah. Mhm.
I guess what I'm suggesting is that that there are all sorts of loose ends here that don't remit, to translate from Bayanese, that don't remit direct academic, right?
Mhm.
It always remete to necessarily to other temples, right? To focus on that, what you're calling the ritual context, it's actually the moments at which, so if there's a claim in Candomblé that you're not the owner of the land, well, how is that translated in interactions with the state, right? And with neighbors?
Yeah.
What are there's an interesting materiality in your work. What are the material signs of that get manipulated?
I have a question. Would they consider themselves, I'm sure you emphasize, to re-emphasize, would they consider themselves protectors of the land rather than owners? So like when somebody questions whether or not they have ownership of the land when they're in conversation with the state, it's like, while the land has its kind of like children's rights, while the child has rights as a child, the parent is the protector of the child. So for now, I speak for the child until the child can speak for itself. The land being the child then, where the land has its own rights and the land can have its own agency, but it cannot speak, so I speak for the land now and I protect the land.
Right.
Would that be the transition?
Yeah, and even speaking for prior generations who weren't able to speak to the state, and that's what I was saying, like, when they're tying themselves to generations of land cultivators, it's like, it took a lot of mobilization and political pressure to get to the point of even having a democratic constitution, let alone one that recognizes Black rights, right? So that's why I'm just interested in this historicity that can't be in the documents, like it just can't be there. And so that's where the ritual interests me, and like the oral histories, I think, provide us an insight that you just can't trace through documentation. That's kind of a major part of my methodology. Historians often don't like this.
Could you expand on that?
What?
Could you expand on
Yeah.
that? Or sorry, did I ask me a question? I'll be done. Please ask.
I can, I'll bring it in again, but I want to hear from you.
No, I just, the position that I really appreciated, your talk, but it makes me think about, the way that, the Gullah Geechee Nation is literally in these same negotiations. Queen Brett, she's the chiefess of the nation, and she makes, it's a long, arduous process, but it has been making these negotiations and with like NGOs, advocacy networks, trying to essentially make these similar claims as being stewards of land that they were brought to. They're descendants of folks who were brought here, and we have been stewarding the land, and we are, here. But I guess I wasn't sure. This is the first one I'm hearing about UFON, but were there other kind of like NGOs or like other, I guess, bureaucrats that you mentioned, that they're kind of employing to make these state, these claims to the state?
Yeah, so in the 1980s, when this first came to be as like a policy applied to Candomblé, the leaders were working directly with the Black movement, like Unificado, that was in Sao Paulo mostly, and so pretty distant from the cultural context of Bahia, but always allying with like Black representatives, and really important cultural figures, and this is always, the caveat that like the Maishi Santos are important culturally, but not politically, but the Black movement definitely brought them into their political movement as well. I'm not familiar with NGOs who are involved in this. I didn't encounter any, but definitely anthropologists, like us, like the intermediaries, and at local university too, like he was mentioning, just important popular figures, and then celebrities, like literally singers, pop stars, like being initiated by My Mininia. All of this is very strategic to get that visibility, that like legitimacy, in the media, basically. So those are the kinds of constellations that I saw in terms of who was mobilizing around this. I think there may be a few like foreign NGOs that try to do something, but we know what NGOs, they don't do a lot in the real, implementation of things. It's mostly discursive. I can try and return to the question of what's not in the documents. That's what I was trying to say with that quote, like don't step here without shoes or with shoes. Like you shouldn't, like the land is speaking to you. Like there are people, in it. Like it's coming from, it's hard to put into words. That's why I try.
They're buried there as well on land.
Yeah, right. Nana is like in the mud, right? Shum is in the water, Oya is in the trees, like, in the wind. And that all of these deities are coming from like millennial histories predating Christ, right? And so all of this is just hard to write down. It's not linear either. Which, do you have a thought?
I just had I guess more so a question, because you did mention that they're essentially different today, and they're coming from, kind of tracing to different, parts of the continent. Do you notice any that are given kind of preference in these negotiations?
Yes, the Yoruba temples for sure. I kind of left that out of the slide. It messes the picture quite a bit, in terms of the hierarchy of prestige and like the competition for resources. There's definitely a different version of this story, right? And I think the stakes of the way I tell it, I was trying to make clear. Why it's important to understand the limited gains and the political strategies, and reframing who the protagonists are in this story too. Really centering the priestesses, public negotiations.
Have you done any comparative work with the movements around territoriality, for instance, in Nigeria, and the way that they've sought recognition from the state? And even, and in that case, utilizing UNESCO, right? But also certain state institutions compared, I don't want to lead you down a whole nother
10 years.
Another 10 years of investigation. There are people that are doing work on that, but I'm just, it would kind of be interesting to bring a conversation together.
Yeah.
To look at what the strategies are that people are using in different places, because there's some similarities and then there's some differences, right? In terms of the lateral that people have to work with certain types of state entities to get, what they need. And then there's also throwing your body in front of voters,
Yeah.
It's not gonna happen unless you have to kill me first. And then also similarities in terms of talking about that the land is alive, and strange phenomenon, electrical lights going, like they're planning to bulldoze a sacred grove, but electrical lights have gone out. Oh, Shun did that,
Yeah,
she's not
exactly.
gonna
The
allow him
wind.
to bulldoze, right? So,
Yeah.
So I think there's an interesting kind of narrative around, or not narrative, but an interesting kind of conversation that could emerge in dialogue between different places.
Yeah,
And
yeah, thank you. I haven't done any research there, and I will say too, I'm most often a historian, and so this is the most policy-oriented work I've ever done. And I think it's important because, well, for a lot of reasons I stated, but I think, historians can be very distant from the reality of the present communities that they're working in, and so it was just really clear kind of to me where, like, my role might be, or how I might be able to, educate on the reality of religious practitioners today. So I'm definitely committed to the project, and like, I mentioned just thinking kind of more globally or hemispherically about how, particularly race-based claims or religious-based claims are made in a national discourse that has such material effects. So it's not just about the ideas or kind of the narration, it's about the actual resources and how but it's like you need the words to get the resources. So that relationship is really interesting. Thank you for helping me think bigger.
You mentioned that in the reconstruction of some of the temples, the government should possibly fund it as they would in a Catholic church.
Mhm.
Was there any support by Catholic leaders for these women living in temples? Because
That's a great question.
there's many churches in
Yeah,
Salvador.
Salvador, they call it the land of 365 churches,
Yeah.
one for every day, which to me is like, well, there were 1,408
Right.
temples, so maybe
So-
we can talk about that. But
But you will find even in New York City, for example, different religious leaders will support people who are different from whatever they are.
yeah, I would say yes. I haven't done research on that specifically, and the closest affiliation are the Black Brotherhoods that have a historic relationship with Candomblé.
That should be,
Yeah, I didn't mention that.
that's important.
Yeah, so that's why Bachifolha goes to the Catholic Church today. They go to Igreja Rosário dos Pretos, the Black Church. So there's very clear relationships between the Catholic Church and Candomblé temples. In the colonial period, it was much more contentious, right? So I would say it took centuries to come to some, peaceful negotiation that really culminated in the 18th, 19th century. But today, the biggest antagonism is between evangelical Christians and Candomblé practitioners. Because there's such a historic relationship between Catholicism and Candomblé. It's not a new tension. It's been kind of, worked on. But evangelicals they just demonize the Candomblé religion. And so most of the hate crimes are coming from evangelical Christians, which is important to know are not only white practitioners either. So it's not like, and not all practitioners of Candomblé are Black, right? So it's not a clear kind of racial divide. It's really a theological tension, just in terms of understanding the deities as demons and as things of the devil. So yeah, there's a lot more there for sure.
I'm wondering about memories of slavery, and if that has ever come up either in any of the documentation
Yes.
that somebody might have preserved or in oral history. It has always struck me that the fact of Brazilian slavery has almost been shunted away from any story of Candomblé. And I'm wondering now if there's any
Yeah.
mention, any.
Yeah, there is a lot. And maybe I took that to be a given and I
Yeah,
could
like
have.
how else would it up here? And like, how did this happen?
Right.
They don't
No,
talk
this
about it.
is all
They don't
about,
talk about it.
and that's why I
Don't
connected
talk.
this to the Confederate monuments, because it's all about how is slavery being memorialized, talked about or not.
But it was.
And not is the
Wow.
main like thing, right? Not talked about, in Brazilian society or education. That was part of the 1988 Constitution, was a law to implement history of Africa and Black history. Like, it just was not in the curriculum, and it's still not really implemented in the ways that, it was hoped to be. But that's true in our own country. That's happening in Florida right now. They're erasing African American history.
Yeah, but it existed. Florida's suppressing something that,
Right, that already existed.
yeah.
Yeah, so,
But that's the same kind of thing in Brazil, though, that there was curriculums that were created and then teachers refused to teach it.
I'd say it's similar.
Yeah.
So memories of slavery, that is the whole justification for them being cultural heritage sites in the first place. But I think that it is focusing on the narrative of like African royalty and, success. And so not centering the violence, which is like so ubiquitous, right, in the telling of history. And so I think it's more about, like, I have a documentary clip I kind of wish I showed, where one of the initiates of Bashipol is, someone asked, how do you feel on your centennial? And she says, I feel like a queen, right? This is about being royalty, about being queens, about being, at the top, right? And so that's like, those are the stakes of like this inversion, right, of the hierarchies of race and gender, because it's a place where Black women are literally worshipped, right? And that's not happening outside of that space.
Did you find any temples where the hierarchy was more leveled out? So rather than inverted, there was less of a hierarchy period?
No, it's extremely hierarchical. And that has to do with the ritual structure, that, and it can be a head priest or a head priestess. I focus on the priestesses, but there are head priests as well. In my book project, I include them in the concept of matriarchy because they are also like mothers. So they may be men, but they're initiating children. They have sons, they have daughters too. But like the hierarchy is based on time of initiation. So if you were just recently initiated, you'd be like a child and you wouldn't know anything. And that's why the eldest are at the top of the hierarchy. And yeah, not all tejeros are led by Black women, particularly today. I showed the recent mapping that said like 63% are led by women, so it's still a majority. But even in temples led by men, like there is a central female figure that has particular ancestral power that's like central to the community. That's what I witnessed. But it's hierarchical. Yes, these are not egalitarian in terms of the ritual structure. Maybe in terms of solidarity and pooling resources, yeah. But there is a very clear hierarchy. Well, thank you so much for your questions and the discussion.
I'm excited for your book.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah,
It's coming together. I even signed a contract, so it's like a real thing. Yeah, I appreciate it, and feel free to keep in touch. I also have a podcast. It's called Brazil Culture Connections, and it's bilingual. So I translate interviews with Brazilian cultural leaders, including women from Candomblé. And they're all available on our website, and we have the transcriptions, translations. You can use them in the classrooms. So do a lot of translations. Thanks for coming out.